So we're going to explore further what it means to be a consumer, but look at it through the work-life balance that ultimately is sold when we are given as consumers. So if you think the current paradigm of a market-orientated way of life, the way to substantiate this way of life is through seeking a work-life balance. That gives us an indication of arbitrage, which we touched upon last episode, and the way how that we can seek to reconcile this, but outside the paradigm. So if we absence agency in order to be credited a limitation through demand, then that absence is what substantiates the value proposition our lives become. The value proposition is in reference to what I describe as an actuary self. So when we understand what an actuary is, so the way how a role of an actuary is used within finance, ultimately it's about looking at risk, the profile of risk to determine to balance, say, competing claims, let's say, against the future. And so if you are an actuary for insurance, well, obviously you have these future liabilities, and so therefore what's incumbent upon an actuary is to establish the risk-reward profile of certain investments that are going to cover those future liabilities, and so in turn ensure that obviously there's sustainability that the decisions, the strategic direction of, say, the allocation of funds is always in reference to that. So an actuary is from a financial point of view, is looking at risk. They're looking at risk and uncertainty. Because we practice existential arbitrage, the actuary self is not predicated on finance as much as what we equivocate that. It's obviously reduced down into the existential of our lives. And so that's why you can look at it from the aspect of work-life balance, because if within, say, the circumstance of an actuary in finance, you've got obviously assets and liabilities, well, when we're looking at our lives, it's not asset and liability, it's more means and labour, leisure. And so we're seeking a balance in reference to the totalising claim that's made on life when given as a buyer's journey. And so ultimately what we are seeking through charting life as a buyer's journey is some kind of balance that we give towards life. So if you are totally beholden to the means part, the marginality of your time that relates to your labour, well, ultimately what you are going to do is that you are going to invest, let's say, in your labour to the point where you can capitalise through the value proposition of your time, through the money that you earn. And ultimately that's seeking as a way of mitigating against risk, the future risk, the uncertainty of the future, through allocating funds that you would utilise in order to fund your consumption at a later date. So it depends on the nature of, there's obviously a myriad of considerations when people are looking at it, but as a principle, it's always work-life balance. So when we're looking at that, then that pits against the means part of our temporality, and the ends part, or labour and leisure, is pitted against an absence. So once again, the marginality of your time, within the margins is where potential lies. And it's because within the margin is totalizes. And we can say that because of the absence of creativity when you're given as a consumer. You're not only credited demand. And so any actuary, what are they ultimately doing when they're an actuary? So this is ultimately one of the roles that we, unbeknownst to ourselves, play. We are mitigating a systemic risk through us being sold on the way our life is given. So if you think of that, if an actuary is looking at uncertainty and then looking at a risk profile, Well, obviously through existential arbitrage, you have what is the risk-free proposition. But as we've talked about prior, you externalize the totalizing claim made on time, and you don't consider that to be a risk because you don't think of your way of life, and ultimately through your marginal actions, what you externalize as a totalizing risk. The totalizing risk is civilizational. So when you're an actuary self, you through your own actions are mitigating any risk that would undermine the system perpetuating itself. Okay, so we don't understand that ultimately we are responsible for the way how the world is given, and we don't understand that it actually occurs through the risk-free proposition of existential arbitrage and how we are an actuary to ensure that there is nothing ventured that would totalize the risk that we obviously refuse to accept, that would obviously compromise the entire paradigm. All right, now why? Well, if you never stop to think of the significance of your actions because you don't understand the opportunity cost of them, and how could you think of the opportunity cost when you don't understand the production process of the principal product that you're given as occurs through that risk-free trade of existential arbitrage? You're sold on your time as a value. You're orientated towards disinhibiting your wants because that's all you're credited. So therefore, your aspirations are commensurate to the vision that you hold out for yourself. And so therefore, you're orientated towards acquitting yourself of that claim through the way how the ideal of independence is legitimized, but through the marginal way that we're orientated towards autonomy or independence, we condition our freedom, and we condition our freedom to ensure that what we don't question persists. It persists in a way where there's no reckoning, right? And there is no reckoning because why? Well, through being an actuary of the system, so you actualize what is asked of you, and you're actuary in the sense of the work-life balance. That totalizing risk you can never venture anything beyond it, because existential totalitarianism is essentially what a buyer's journey is, and so. And so what happens in that context is that you kind of divide the self through the marginal action or the marginal way that you're orientated towards that independence. And through that, you externalize the risk that other people manage on your behalf, as it were. Think of the nature of that you're working for your entire life, and then you're seeking financial independence, or you're giving over your funds towards you're giving them to investment bankers or fund managers that are essentially working on your behalf, but that's all part of the same that's the same apparatus of capture that actualizes what you set and train when you don't question the way how you produce yourself. And so in that way, if you step back, why is that important? Well, it's important in the sense that any sense of balance that we have does not address our way of life being totally out of whack when you're given as a consumer, or when you're only credited a limitation of agency. So if you're only credited a limitation of agency, you're marginal, you're not indivisibly given towards life. And if you're not indivisibly given towards life, then ultimately what you've done is you've outsourced a part of life to intermediaries that work on your behalf, but ultimately their interest is to maintain the paradigm that occurs through you not questioning. Because if you don't question you being the principal product, then you won't understand the way how everything is contingent upon your own actions and the opportunity cost when life's given as a risk-free proposition or a buyer's journey. So in order to venture a risk, you have to take a step beyond the paradigm, and that ultimately relates to the way how that we act, and the way how existential arbitrage sets in a way to collectivize a dystopian future through our unavowed utopianism. And essentially that's what we'll be talking about in the next episode. Cheers.